Hello again and welcome back to our how to texture our character. So we're just continuing on from the previous video. So just working on the highlights. I'm pretty happy with how the highlights have come together. So I'm just going back into the shadows now, and I'm going to work on this one just a little bit more. So here I'm actually erasing like completely the pocket, like where the seam is, so where the end of the UV map is there. Just clearing up that shadow a little bit more, because you're not going to have too much shadow at the top of the pocket. I'm just checking my brush there to see if it's doing what I want it to do. It's not, so I'm going to go into the brush settings here and play with those just a little bit. So just bringing down the spacing. Yeah, I think that should be fine. Just bring down the spacing a little bit. So there we go. It doesn't show as much of the brush itself when it's got a lower spacing. So continuing on with that, with my eraser, just going in and deleting some of the shadow on the top of the pocket here. Here I'm going to bring out that back pocket a little bit. It's getting a little lost in the shadow. So I'm just going to remove some of the shadow a little bit around the lip of the pant here, so where the belt will fall, and just define the invisible pocket just a little bit more here. Mostly just by removing some of the shadow that I've already laid down. And maybe just putting a little bit underneath. So again, using the smudge and to blend in my my shadows with the ones that I've already done, and then continuing on with the removing of the shadows on the pockets. So I'll do this on both halves of the pant in order to get the seams to match up as best I can. Okay, with that done, I can see that the pants are coming together quite nicely. The folds are defined well, and I'm happy with how things are going. So what I'm not quite happy with is everything's looking pretty smooth. So what I want to do is add just a little bit more texture to the piece at the moment. So what I've done is created a new layer, and I've filled it completely with the medium color, like the default pan color, so the middle one. And then I've gone up to I've added the mask, so I've selected the shape of the pants there, and I've added it as a mask. Then I've gone to noise filter, add noise, and I've added just a little bit of noise to the level there. So if we go in, you can see it how it's kind of made a little bit of given it a bit of roughness. So I've also played with the layer blend mode a little bit as well, and I've pulled back the opacity just so, or the fill, just so that it's not too overwhelming. We just want it to add just a little bit of depth and richness to the overall feel of the pants. Okay, so now that I'm happy with that, I'll name the layer, and I can move on to the next thing. What we can do now is take our texture and have a look at it in Mudbox. So save it out as your TGA, and it should automatically update in Max. I've accidentally left my palette on, so it's showing up on the arms there. I just go back and turn that off. You can see how it's live updated in the scene. So you can see we've got a definite seam on this pocket here. Not so much on this pocket, but definitely on the other side. So we need to match that as best we can. So going back into Photoshop, we can fix that. If you're not quite sure which side of the UV shell that you need to be working, you can always add a UV layer in your a UV unwrap, sorry, in your modifier stack, and select the face so you can see where it is in the shells that you need to work, you need to focus on. But I already know, so I'm just going to go back in and work on that pocket and try and match it up as best as I can. So when you're painting a texture, there can be a lot of back and forth between Max and Photoshop just to make sure that the seams are matching. So yeah, it's just constant back and forth, making sure that you just remove a little bit, you add a little bit in order to get the seams to line up. As you can see, it can be quite tricky to get that to match and to line up correctly so that the seams aren't as visible. This is why we try to hide our seams as well as much as we can in areas that have a natural seam, so where the seam of the pants are and that sort of thing. But since the pocket goes over the seam, we need to make sure that it matches so it doesn't break the texture when we look at it. So it's just constant back and forth to make sure that we've got it. Okay, you can see that that's lessened it. There's still a little bit of work to be done, but we're on our way to getting that right. Okay, so we've got that matching up now. I'm pretty happy with how the shadows and the highlights are working on the model. So what we can do now is add a little bit more detail to the pen. So I'm going to add the seams. So I've created a new layer and I've named it seams. I'll name it correctly, or spell it correctly I should say. And we can go in and just start to paint where the seams are. So since this is a hidden seam, I just have to darken up the shadow and put a little bit of the highlight in where it is. So to do that, I just double clicked on my color swatch over there on the left, brought up the color picker and picked a slightly darker brown, and then I'm just going to go in here and paint in where the seam is. So just straight down the center of the seam all the way over to the end. So where it goes over the UV, the line of the UV that I'm using as a guide, I do go over that as well. So you always want to go over the edge of your shell a little bit when you're doing the painting. So you can see on my normal map there's a bleed. It goes outside of where the UV cage is, or the shell. This is referred to as a bleed in a lot of places. So you need the bleed in order to keep your texture from showing seams. Now in Engine, a lot of the time this is usually automatic, but it will mip. It's called mipping. So this is when the camera pulls out further away, the texture size is crunched down to something smaller. So when we do that, if we don't have a sufficient enough bleed on our shell or on our texture, we will start to see parts of whatever is next to it. So see on the pants we've got the eye next to it. If we didn't have the bleed and it mipped down, so our texture got crunched down, so when the character is far away, we'll start to see parts of the eye show up on the leg. Or if we had black in the back of the texture, we would start to see black seams. So it starts to show up when you pull away, the camera pulls away in game. It's called mipping. So the bleed prevents that. So we always want to go over the edge of our shell when we paint, or of our UV cage, which is always there as we work. Okay, so now our seams are complete. I'm happy with how everything is looking. We can move on to the next part of our model. So I'm going to start working on the belt. So the belt is pretty simple. It's hidden most of the time, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this belt. I'm just going to select this edge here, and using my gradient tool and a dark brown that I've just selected off the base color, I'm just going to add a quick gradient to the belt itself. So just the top and the bottom, so that it's got like a lip where the shirt is high over the top and where it's showing on the belt, so the top and bottom of the pant. And then put a slight highlight on it as well, using the gradient tool, but this time with a cylinder instead of the straight gradient. And then I'm just going to go in and remove a little bit of that. Okay, so just a little bit there. It's not a lot, like I said. Once with that done, I'm going to do the same with the buckle. So I'm just going to select a slightly darker grey than the base color I've used there. I've darkened it off a little bit because the lighter color would start to bloom out when the light hits it. So I've just used a darker color, and I've selected another darker grey, and I'm just checking to make sure that I've put the darker grey color on the back of the buckle, so to make sure that I haven't used the front, so just so I know which is the front, which is the back. So I know this part up here is the front, so I'm going to go in, select the inner circle there, center there, and I'm going to go to select, modify feather, and I'll put a slight feather on that and delete a couple of times to get a nice soft shadow on it. I'm then going again this is on the highlights this time, and I'm going to go around the edge of the buckle, and I'm going to put a few kind of like white squiggles, but it'll show up kind of like scratching, so where the buckle would get a lot of wear, I'm just going around the edge just to put a bit of wear on that. With that done, I'm going to go back to my belt now, and again using the darker color, I'm just going to see if I can add, I'm just trying something out here, I'm not quite sure if I like it, but I want to try and add some kind of detail to the map, so it kind of looks like it's a fabric belt, but it's almost like canvas. So I'm just going in here and putting a few lines in just to give it a little bit of detail, and I've decided I didn't like that, so I'm going to try and use a gradient fill. So just selecting the area, going up to layer style, and adding a pattern overlay. So just finding the pattern that I wanted, so which was canvas obviously, and hitting OK. So then I've brought the opacity down on that a little bit more to make it sit, and then I'll try and blend in what I've done, or what I've created with the shadows and the highlights to get that belt the way I want it. Okay, so just before I continue on, I'm doing a bit of cleanup on my layers here, so making sure my layers are named correctly, and I need to make sure that all that detail that I've done on the shadow isn't bleeding over into the next section that I want to work on. So I'm selecting the shirt, and I'm deleting it from the shadow and the highlights layer to make sure that the bleed from the pants isn't coming over onto the shirt, and then I can start to work on the shirt itself. So again, using the same procedure as I did with the pants, starting with the shadows, I build up where they're going to lie. Okay, so just using the same procedure as I did with the pants, so using my brush, my eraser, and occasionally my smudge and blur tools, just to build up the shadows on the shirt. Okay, we'll leave that here and we'll continue on in the next video.